Book 2, Chapter 9 of My Ántonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 9. There was a curious social situation in Black Hawk. All the young men felt the attraction of the fine, well set up country girls who had come to town to earn a living, and in nearly every case to help the father struggle out of debt, or to make it possible for the younger children of the family to go to school. Those girls had grown up in the first bitter hard times, and had got little schooling themselves. But the younger brothers and sisters, for whom they had made such sacrifices, and who have had advantages, never seem to me, when I meet them now, half as interesting or as well educated. The older girls, who helped to break up the wild sod, learned so much from life, from poverty, from their mothers and grandmothers. They had all, like Ántonia, been early awakened and made observant by coming at a tender age from an old country to a new. I can remember a score of these country girls who were in service in Black Hawk during the few years I lived there, and I can remember something unusual and engaging about each of them. Physically they were almost a race apart, and out-of-door work had given them a vigour which, when they got over their first shyness in coming to town, developed into a positive carriage and freedom of movement, and made them conspicuous among Black Hawk women. That was before the day of high school athletics. Girls who had to walk more than half a mile to school were pitied. There was not a tennis court in the town. Physical exercise was thought rather inelegant for the daughters of well-to-do families. Some of the high school girls were jolly and pretty, but they stayed indoors in winter because of the cold, and in summer because of the heat. When one danced with them, their bodies never moved inside their clothes. Their muscles seemed to ask but one thing: not to be disturbed. I remember those girls merely as faces in the schoolroom, gay and rosy, or listless and dull, cut off below the shoulders, like cherubs, by the ink-smeared tops of the high desks that were surely put there to make us round-shouldered and hollow-chested. The daughters of Black Hawk merchants had a confident, uninquiring belief that they were refined, and that the country girls who worked out were not. The American farmers in our county were quite as hard-pressed as their neighbours from other countries. All alike had come to Nebraska with little capital and no knowledge of the soil they must subdue. All had borrowed money on their land. But no matter in what straits the Pennsylvanian or Virginian found himself, he would not let his daughters go out into service. Unless his girls could teach at a country school, they sat at home in poverty. The Bohemian and Scandinavian girls could not get positions as teachers because they had had no opportunity to learn the language. Determined to help in the struggle to clear the homestead from debt, they had no alternative but to go into service. Some of them, after they came to town, remained as serious and as discreet in behaviour as they had been when they had ploughed and herded on their father's farm. Others, like the 3 Bohemian Marys, tried to make up for the years of youth they had lost. But every one of them did what she had set out to do, and sent home those hard-earned dollars. The girls, I knew, were always helping to pay for ploughs and reapers, brood sows, or steers to fatten. One result of this family solidarity was that the foreign farmers in our county were the first to become prosperous. After the fathers were out of debt, the daughters married the sons of neighbours, usually of like nationality, and the girls who once worked in Black Hawk kitchens are today managing big farms and fine families of their own. Their children are better off than the children of the town women they used to serve. I thought the attitude of the town people towards these girls very stupid. If I told my schoolmates that Lena Lingard's grandfather was a clergyman and much respected in Norway, they looked at me blankly. What did it matter? All foreigners were ignorant people who couldn't speak English. There was not a man in Black Hawk who had the intelligence or cultivation, much less the personal distinction, of Antonia's father. Yet people saw no difference between her and the 3 Marys. They were all Bohemians, all hired girls. I always knew I should live long enough to see my country girls come into their own, and I have. Today, the best that a harassed Black Hawk merchant can hope for is to sell provisions and farm machinery and automobiles to the rich farms where that first crop of stalwart Bohemian and Scandinavian girls are now the mistresses. The Black Hawk boys looked forward to marrying Black Hawk girls and living in a brand new little house with best chairs that must not be sat upon and hand-painted china that must not be used. But sometimes a young fellow would look up from his ledger, or out through the grating of his father's bank, and let his eyes follow Lena Lingard as she passed the window with her slow, undulating walk, or Tiny Soderball tripping by in her short skirt and striped stockings. The country girls were considered a menace to the social order. Their beauty shone out too boldly against a conventional background. But anxious mothers need have felt no alarm. They mistook the mettle of their sons. The respect for respectability was stronger than any desire in Black Hawk youth. Our young man of position was like the son of a royal house. The boy who swept out his office or drove his delivery wagon might frolic with the jolly country girls, but he himself must sit all evening in a plush parlour where conversation dragged so perceptibly that the father often came in and made blundering efforts to warm up the atmosphere. On his way home from his dull call he would perhaps meet Tony and Lena coming along the sidewalk whispering to each other, or the three Bohemian Marys in their long plush coats and caps, comporting themselves with a dignity that only made their eventful histories the more piquant. If he went to the hotel to see a travelling man on business, there was Tiny, arching her shoulders at him like a kitten. If he went into the laundry to get his collars, there were the four Danish girls, smiling up from their ironing boards with their white throats and their pink cheeks. The three Marys were the heroines of a cycle of scandalous stories, which the old men were fond of relating as they stood about the cigar-stand in the drug-store. Mary Dusak had been housekeeper for a bachelor rancher from Boston, and after several years in his service she was forced to retire from the world for a short time. Later she came back to town to take the place of her friend, Mary Svoboda, who was similarly embarrassed. The three Marys were considered as dangerous as high explosives to have about the kitchen, yet they were such good cooks and such admirable housekeepers that they never had to look for a place. The Vanna's tent brought the town boys and the country girls together on neutral ground. Sylvester Lovett, who was cashier in his father's bank, always found his way to the tent on Saturday night. He took all the dances Lena Lingard would give him, and even grew bold enough to walk home with her. If his sisters or their friends happened to be among the onlookers on popular nights, Sylvester stood back in the shadow under the cottonwood trees, smoking and watching Lena with a harassed expression. Several times I stumbled upon him there in the dark, and I felt rather sorry for him. He reminded me of Ole Benson, who used to sit on the draw side and watch Lena herd her cattle. Later in the summer, when Lena went home for a week to visit her mother, I heard from Antonia that young Lovett drove all the way out there to see her and took her buggy riding. In my ingenuousness, I hoped that Sylvester would marry Lena, and thus give all the country girls a better position in the town. Sylvester dallied about Lena until he began to make mistakes in his work, had to stay at the bank until after dark to make his books balance. He was daft about her, and everyone knew it. To escape from his predicament, he ran away with a widow 6 years older than himself who owned a half section. This remedy worked apparently. He never looked at Lena again, nor lifted his eyes as he ceremoniously tipped his hat when he happened to meet her on the sidewalk. So that was what they were like, I thought, these white-handed, high-collared clerks and bookkeepers. I used to glare at young Lovett from a distance and only wished I had some way of showing my contempt for him. End of chapter 9.
Book 2, Chapter 10 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Katie Gibney, Arkansas, November 2007. My Antonia by Willa Cather, Book 2, The Hired Girls, Chapter 10. It was at the Vanna's tent that Ántonia was discovered. Hitherto she had been looked upon more as a ward of the Harlings than as one of the hired girls. She had lived in their house and yard and garden; her thoughts never seemed to stray outside that little kingdom. But after the tent came to town she began to go about with Tiny and Lena and their friends. The Vannas often said that Ántonia was the best dancer of them all. I sometimes heard murmurs in the crowd outside the pavilion that Mrs. Harling would soon have her hands full with that girl. The young men began to joke with each other about the Harlings' Tony, as they did about the Marshalls' Anna or the gardener's Tiny. Ántonia talked and thought of nothing but the tent. She hummed the dance tunes all day. When supper was late, she hurried with her dishes, dropped and smashed them in her excitement. At the first call of the music she became irresponsible. If she hadn't time to dress, she merely flung off her apron and shot out of the kitchen door. Sometimes I went with her. The moment the lighted tent came into view she would break into a run, like a boy. There were always partners waiting for her. She began to dance before she got her breath. Ántonia's success at the tent had its consequences. The iceman lingered too long now when he came into the covered porch to fill the refrigerator. The delivery boys hung about the kitchen when they brought the groceries. Young farmers who were in town for Saturday came tramping through the yard to the back door to engage dances, or to invite Tony to parties and picnics. Lena and Norwegian Anna dropped in to help her with her work, so that she could get away early. The boys who brought her home after the dances sometimes laughed at the back gate and wakened Mr. Harling from his first sleep. A crisis was inevitable. One Saturday night Mr. Harling had gone down to the cellar for beer. As he came up the stairs in the dark, he heard scuffling on the back porch, and then the sound of a vigorous slap. He looked out through the side door in time to see a pair of long legs vaulting over the picket fence. Ántonia was standing there, angry and excited. Young Harry Payne, who was to marry his employer's daughter on Monday, had come to the tent with a crowd of friends and danced all evening. Afterward he begged Ántonia to let him walk home with her. She said she supposed he was a nice young man, as he was one of Miss Frances's friends, and she didn't mind. On the back porch he tried to kiss her, and when she protested, because he was going to be married on Monday, he caught her and kissed her until she got one hand free and slapped him. Mr. Harling put his beer bottles down on the table. "This is what I've been expecting, Ántonia. You've been going with girls who have a reputation for being free and easy, and now you've got the same reputation. I won't have this and that fellow tramping about my backyard all the time. This is the end of it, tonight. It stops, short. You can quit going to these dances, or you can hunt another place. Think it over." The next morning when Mrs. Harling and Frances tried to reason with Ántonia, they found her agitated but determined. "Stop going to the tent?" she panted. "I wouldn't think of it for a minute. My own father couldn't make me stop. Mr. Harling ain't my boss outside my work. I won't give up my friends either. The boys I go with are nice fellows. I thought Mr. Payne was all right, too, because he used to come here. I guess I gave him a red face for his wedding, all right," she blazed out indignantly. "You'll have to do one thing or the other, Ántonia," Mrs. Harling told her decidedly. "I can't go back on what Mr. Harling has said. This is his house." "Then I'll just leave, Mrs. Harling. Lena's been wanting me to get a place closer to her for a long while. Mary Svoboda's going away from the Cutters to work at the hotel, and I can have her place." Mrs. Harling rose from her chair. "Ántonia, if you go to the Cutters to work, you cannot come back to this house again. You know what that man is. It will be the ruin of you." Tony snatched up the tea kettle and began to pour boiling water over the glasses, laughing excitedly. "Oh, I can take care of myself. I'm a lot stronger than Cutter is. They pay $4 there, and there's no children. The work's nothing. I can have every evening, and be out a lot in the afternoons." "I thought you liked children, Tony. What's come over you?" "I don't know. Something has." Ántonia tossed her head and set her jaw. "A girl like me has got to take her good times when she can. Maybe there won't be any tent next year. I guess I want to have my fling, like the other girls." Mrs. Harling gave a short, harsh laugh. "If you go to work for the Cutters, you're likely to have a fling that you won't get up from in a hurry." Frances said, when she told grandmother and me about this scene, that every pan and plate and cup on the shelves trembled when her mother walked out of the kitchen. Mrs. Harling declared bitterly that she wished she had never let herself get fond of Ántonia. End of chapter 10. Book 2, Chapter 11 of My Ántonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Katie Gibney, Arkansas, December 2007. My Ántonia by Willa Cather, Book 2, The Hired Girls, Chapter 11. Wick Cutter was the money-lender who had fleeced poor Russian Peter. When a farmer once got into the habit of going to Cutter, it was like gambling or the lottery. In an hour of discouragement he went back. Cutter's first name was Wycliffe, and he liked to talk about his pious bringing up. He contributed regularly to the Protestant churches, "for sentiment's sake," as he said with a flourish of the hand. He came from a town in Iowa, where there were a great many Swedes, and could speak a little Swedish, which gave him a great advantage with the early Scandinavian settlers. In every frontier settlement there are men who have come there to escape restraint. Cutter was one of the fast set of Black Hawk business men. He was an inveterate gambler, though a poor loser. When we saw a light burning in his office late at night, we knew that a game of poker was going on. Cutter boasted that he never drank anything stronger than sherry, and he said he got his start in life by saving the money that other young men spent for cigars. He was full of moral maxims for boys. When he came to our house on business, he quoted Poor Richard's Almanac to me, and told me he was delighted to find a town boy who could milk a cow. He was particularly affable to grandmother, and whenever they met he would begin at once to talk about the good old times and simple living. I detested his pink bald head, and his yellow whiskers, always soft and glistening. It was said he brushed them every night, as a woman does her hair. His white teeth looked factory made. His skin was red and rough, as if from perpetual sunburn. He often went away to hot springs to take mud baths. He was notoriously dissolute with women. 2 Swedish girls who had lived in his house were the worse for the experience. One of them he had taken to Omaha and established in the business for which he had fitted her. He still visited her. Cutter lived in a state of perpetual warfare with his wife, and yet, apparently, they never thought of separating. They dwelt in a fussy scroll-work house, painted white and buried in thick evergreens, with a fussy white fence and barn. Cutter thought he knew a great deal about horses, and usually had a colt he was training for the track. On Sunday mornings one could see him out at the fair grounds, speeding around the race course in his trotting buggy, wearing yellow gloves and a black and white check traveling cap, his whiskers blowing back in the breeze. If there were any boys about, Cutter would offer one of them a quarter to hold the stopwatch, and then drive off, saying he had no change and would fix it up next time. No one could cut his lawn or wash his buggy to suit him. He was so fastidious and prim about his place that a boy would go to a good deal of trouble to throw a dead cat into his backyard, or to dump a sackful of tin cans in his alley. It was a peculiar combination of old maidishness and licentiousness that made Cutter seem so despicable. He had certainly met his match when he married Mrs. Cutter. She was a terrifying-looking person, almost a giantess in height, raw-boned, with iron-gray hair, a face always flushed, and prominent hysterical eyes. When she meant to be entertaining and agreeable, she nodded her head incessantly, and snapped her eyes at one. Her teeth were long and curved, like a horse's. People said babies always cried if she smiled at them. Her face had a kind of fascination for me. It was the very color and shape of anger. There was a gleam of something akin to insanity in her full, intense eyes. She was formal in manner, and made calls in rustling, steel gray brocades and a tall bonnet with bristling aigrettes. Mrs. Cutter painted china so assiduously that even her washbowls and pitchers, and her husband's shaving mug, were covered with violets and lilies. Once when Cutter was exhibiting some of his wife's china to a caller, he dropped a piece. Mrs. Cutter put a handkerchief to her lips as if she were going to faint, and said grandly, "Mr. Cutter, you have broken all the commandments. Spare the finger bowls." They quarreled from the moment Cutter came into the house until they went to bed at night, and their hired girls reported these scenes to the town at large. Mrs. Cutter had several times cut paragraphs about unfaithful husbands out of the newspapers, and mailed them to Cutter in a disguised handwriting. Cutter would come home at noon, find the mutilated journal in the paper rack, and triumphantly fit the clipping into the space from which it had been cut. Those two could quarrel all morning about whether he ought to put on his heavy or his light underwear, and all evening about whether he had taken cold or not. The Cutters had major as well as minor subjects for dispute. The chief of these was the question of inheritance. Mrs. Cutter told her husband it was plainly his fault they had no children. He insisted that Mrs. Cutter had purposely remained childless, with the determination to outlive him and to share his property with her people, whom he detested. To this she would reply that unless he changed his mode of life she would certainly outlive him. After listening to her insinuation about his physical soundness, Cutter would resume his dumb-bell practice for a month, or rise daily at the hour when his wife most liked to sleep, dress noisily, and drive out to the track with his trotting horse. Once when they had quarreled about household expenses, Mrs. Cutter put on her brocade, and went among their friends soliciting orders for painted china, saying that Mr. Cutter had compelled her to "live by her brush." Cutter wasn't shamed, as she had expected; he was delighted. Cutter often threatened to chop down the cedar trees which half buried the house. His wife declared she would leave him if she were stripped of the privacy which she felt these trees afforded her. That was his opportunity, surely, but he never cut down the trees. The Cutters seemed to find their relations to each other interesting and stimulating, and certainly the rest of us found them so. Wick Cutter was different from any other rascal I have ever known, but I have found Mrs. Cutters all over the world, sometimes founding new religions, sometimes being forcibly fed, easily recognizable, even when superficially tamed. End of chapter 11. Book 2, Chapter 12 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Katie Gibney, Arkansas, December 2007. My Antonia by Willa Cather, Book 2, The Hired Girls, Chapter 12. After Ántonia went to live with the Cutters, she seemed to care about nothing but picnics and parties and having a good time. When she was not going to a dance, she sewed until midnight. Her new clothes were the subject of caustic comment. Under Lena's direction she copied Mrs. Gardner's new party dress and Mrs. Smith's street costume so ingeniously, in cheap materials, that those ladies were greatly annoyed, and Mrs. Cutter, who was jealous of them, was secretly pleased. Tony wore gloves now, and high-heeled shoes and feathered bonnets, and she went downtown nearly every afternoon with Tiny and Lena and the Marshalls' Norwegian Anna. We high school boys used to linger on the playground at the afternoon recess to watch them as they came tripping down the hill, along the board sidewalk, two and two. They were growing prettier every day, but as they passed us I used to think with pride that Ántonia, like Snow White in the fairy tale, was still fairest of them all. Being a senior now, I got away from school early. Sometimes I overtook the girls downtown and coaxed them into the ice cream parlor, where they would sit chattering and laughing, telling me all the news from the country. I remember how angry Tiny Solderball made me one afternoon. She declared she had heard grandmother was going to make a Baptist preacher of me. "I guess you'll have to stop dancing and wear a white necktie then. Won't he look funny, girls?" Lena laughed. "You'll have to hurry up, Jim. If you're going to be a preacher, I want you to marry me. You must promise to marry us all, and then baptize the babies." Norwegian Anna, always dignified, looked at her reprovingly. "Baptists don't believe in christening babies, do they, Jim?" I told her I didn't know what they believed, and didn't care, and that I certainly wasn't going to be a preacher. "That's too bad," Tiny simpered. She was in a teasing mood. "You'd make such a good one. You're so studious. Maybe you'd like to be a professor. You used to teach Tony, didn't you?" Ántonia broke in. "I've set my heart on Jim being a doctor. You'd be good with sick people, Jim. Your grandmother's trained you up so nice. My papa always said you were an awful smart boy." I said I was going to be whatever I pleased. "Won't you be surprised, Miss Tiny, if I turn out to be a regular devil of a fellow?" They laughed until a glance from Norwegian Anna checked them. The high school principal had just come into the front part of the shop to buy bread for supper. Anna knew the whisper was going about that I was a sly one. People said there must be something queer about a boy who showed no interest in girls of his own age, but who could be lively enough when he was with Tony and Lena or the three Marys. The enthusiasm for the dance, which the Vannas had kindled, did not at once die out. After the tent left town, the Euchre Club became the Owl Club, and gave dances in the Masonic Hall once a week. I was invited to join, but declined. I was moody and restless that winter, and tired of the people I saw every day. Charlie Harling was already at Annapolis, while I was still sitting in Black Hawk, answering to my name at roll call every morning, rising from my desk at the sound of a bell, and marching out like the grammar school children. Mrs. Harling was a little cool toward me, because I continued to champion Antonia. What was there for me to do after supper? Usually I had learned the next day's lessons by the time I left the school building, and I couldn't sit still and read forever. In the evening I used to prowl about, hunting for diversion. There lay the familiar streets, frozen with snow or liquid with mud. They led to the houses of good people who were putting the babies to bed, or simply sitting still before the parlor stove, digesting their supper. Black Hawk had two saloons. One of them was admitted, even by the church people, to be as respectable as a saloon could be. Handsome Anton Jelinek, who had rented his homestead and come to town, was the proprietor. In his saloon there were long tables where the Bohemian and German farmers could eat the lunches they brought from home while they drank their beer. Jelinek kept rye bread on hand, and smoked fish and strong imported cheeses to please the foreign palate. I liked to drop into his barroom and listen to the talk. But one day he overtook me on the street and clapped me on the shoulder. "Jim," he said, "I am good friends with you, and I always like to see you. But you know how the church people think about saloons. Your grandpa has always treated me fine, and I don't like to have you come into my place, because I know he don't like it, and it puts me in bad with him." So I was shut out of that. One could hang about the drug store and listen to the old men who sat there every evening, talking politics and telling raw stories. One could go to the cigar factory and chat with the old German who raised canaries for sale, and look at his stuffed birds. But whatever you began with him, the talk went back to taxidermy. There was the depot, of course. I often went down to see the night train come in, and afterwards sat a while with the disconsolate telegrapher who was always hoping to be transferred into Omaha or Denver, where there was some life. He was sure to bring out his pictures of actresses and dancers. He got them with cigarette coupons, and nearly smoked himself to death to possess these desired forms and faces. For a change, one could talk to the station agent, but he was another malcontent, spent all his spare time writing letters to officials requesting a transfer. He wanted to get back to Wyoming where he could go trout fishing on Sundays. He used to say there was nothing in life for him but trout streams, ever since he'd lost his twins. These were the distractions I had to choose from. There were no other lights burning downtown after 9 o'clock. On starlight nights I used to pace up and down those long cold streets, scowling at the little sleeping houses on either side, with their storm windows and covered back porches. They were flimsy shelters, most of them poorly built of light wood, with spindle porch posts horribly mutilated by the turning lathe. Yet for all their frailness, How much jealousy and envy and unhappiness some of them managed to contain! The life that went on in them seemed to me made up of evasions and negations, shifts to save cooking, to save washing and cleaning, devices to propitiate the tongue of gossip. This guarded mode of existence was like living under a tyranny. People's speech, their voices, their very glances became furtive and repressed. Every individual taste, every natural appetite, was bridled by caution. The people asleep in those houses, I thought, tried to live like the mice in their own kitchens, to make no noise, to leave no trace, to slip over the surface of things in the dark. The growing piles of ashes and cinders in the back yards were the only evidence that the wasteful, consuming process of life went on at all. On Tuesday nights the Owl Club danced; then there was a little stir in the streets, and here and there one could see a lighted window until midnight; but the next night all was dark again. After I refused to join the Owls, as they were called, I made a bold resolve to go to the Saturday night dances at Firemen's Hall. I knew it would be useless to acquaint my elders with any such plan. Grandfather didn't approve of dancing anyway. He would only say that if I wanted to dance I could go to the Masonic Hall among the people we knew. It was just my point that I saw altogether too much of the people we knew. My bedroom was on the ground floor, and as I studied there I had a stove in it. I used to retire to my room early on Saturday night, change my shirt and collar, and put on my Sunday coat. I waited until all was quiet and the old people were asleep, then raised my window, climbed out, and went softly through the yard. The first time I deceived my grandparents I felt rather shabby, perhaps even the second time, but I soon ceased to think about it. The dance at the Firemen's Hall was the one thing I looked forward to all the week. There I met the same people I used to see at the Vanna's tent. Sometimes there were Bohemians from Wilbur, or German boys who came down on the afternoon freight from Bismarck. Tony and Lena and Tiny were always there, and the 3 Bohemian Marys, and the Danish laundry girls. The 4 Danish girls lived with the laundryman and his wife in their house behind the laundry, with a big garden where the clothes were hung out to dry. The laundryman was a kind, wise old fellow, who paid his girls well, looked out for them, and gave them a good home. He told me once that his own daughter died just as she was getting old enough to help her mother, and that he had been trying to make up for it ever since. On summer afternoons he used to sit for hours on the sidewalk in front of his laundry, his newspaper lying on his knee, watching his girls through the big open window while they ironed and talked in Danish. The clouds of white dust that blew up the street, the gusts of hot wind that withered his vegetable garden, never disturbed his calm. His droll expression seemed to say that he had found the secret of contentment. Morning and evening he drove about in his spring wagon, distributing freshly ironed clothes, and collecting bags of linen that cried out for his suds and sunny drying lines. His girls never looked so pretty at the dances as they did standing by the ironing board, or over the tubs, washing the fine pieces, their white arms and throats bare, their cheeks bright as the brightest wild roses, their gold hair moist with the steam or the heat, and curling in little damp spirals about their ears. They had not learned much English, and were not so ambitious as Tony or Lena, but they were kind, simple girls, and they were always happy. When one danced with them, one smelled their clean, freshly ironed clothes that had been put away with rosemary leaves from Mr. Jensen's garden. There were never girls enough to go round at those dances, but every one wanted a turn with Tony and Lena. Lena moved without exertion, rather indolently, and her hand often accented the rhythm softly on her partner's shoulder. She smiled if one spoke to her, but seldom answered. The music seemed to put her into a soft waking dream, and her violet-colored eyes looked sleepily and confidingly at one from under her long lashes. When she sighed she exhaled a heavy perfume of sachet powder. To dance "Home, Sweet Home" with Lena was like coming in with the tide. She danced every dance like a waltz, and it was always the same waltz, the waltz of coming home to something, of inevitable, fated return. After a while one got restless under it, as one does under the heat of a soft, sultry summer day. When you spun out into the floor with Tony, you didn't return to anything. You set out every time upon a new adventure. I liked to schottische with her, she had so much spring and variety, and was always putting in new steps and slides. She taught me to dance against and around the hard and fast beat of the music. If, instead of going to the end of the railroad, old Mr. Shimerda had stayed in New York and picked up a living with his fiddle, how different Antonia's life might have been. Ántonia often went to the dances with Larry Donovan, a passenger conductor who was a kind of professional ladies' man, as we said. I remember how admiringly all the boys looked at her the night she first wore her velveteen dress, made like Mrs. Gardner's black velvet. She was lovely to see, with her eyes shining, and her lips always a little parted when she danced. That constant dark color in her cheeks never changed. One evening when Donovan was out on his run, Ántonia came to the hall with Norwegian Anna and her young man, and that night I took her home. When we were in the cutter's yard, sheltered by the evergreens, I told her she must kiss me good night. "Why, sure, Jim." A moment later she drew her face away and whispered indignantly, "Why, Jim, you know you ain't right to kiss me like that. I'll tell your grandmother on you." "Lena Lingard lets me kiss her," I retorted, "and I'm not half as fond of her as I am of you." "Lena does?" Tony gasped. "If she's up to any of her nonsense with you, I'll scratch her eyes out." She took my arm again and we walked out of the gate and up and down the sidewalk. "Now don't you go and be a fool like some of these town boys. You're not going to sit around here and whittle store boxes and tell stories all your life. You are going away to school and make something of yourself. I'm just awful proud of you. You won't go and get mixed up with the Swedes, will you?" "I don't care anything about any of them but you," I said. "And you'll always treat me like a kid, I suppose." She laughed and threw her arms around me. "I expect I will, but you're a kid I'm awful fond of anyhow. You can like me all you want to, but if I see you hanging round with Lena much, I'll go to your grandmother as sure as your name's Jim Burden. Lena's all right, only, well, you know yourself she's soft that way. She can't help it. It's natural to her." If she was proud of me, I was so proud of her that I carried my head high as I emerged from the dark cedars and shut the cutter's gate softly behind me. Her warm, sweet face, her kind arms, and the true heart in her, she was, oh, she was still my Ántonia. I looked with contempt at the dark, silent little houses about me as I walked home, and thought of the stupid young men who were asleep in some of them. I knew where the real women were, though I was only a boy, and I would not be afraid of them either. I hated to enter the still house when I went home from the dances, and it was long before I could get to sleep. Toward morning I used to have pleasant dreams. Sometimes Tony and I were out in the country, sliding down straw stacks as we used to do, climbing up the yellow mountains over and over, and slipping down the smooth sides into soft piles of chaff. One dream I dreamed a great many times, and it was always the same. I was in a harvest field full of shocks, and I was lying against one of them. Lena Lingard came across the stubble barefoot, in a short skirt, with a curved reaping hook in her hand, and she was flushed like the dawn, with a kind of luminous rosiness all about her. She sat down beside me, turned to me with a soft sigh, and said, "Now they are all gone, and I can kiss you as much as I like." I used to wish I could have this flattering dream about Ántonia, but I never did. End of chapter 12. Book 2, Chapter 13 of My Ántonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Katie Gibney, Arkansas, December 2007. My Ántonia by Willa Cather, Book 2, The Hired Girls, Chapter 13. I noticed one afternoon that grandmother had been crying. Her feet seemed to drag as she moved about the house, and I got up from the table where I was studying and went to her, asking if she didn't feel well, and if I couldn't help her with her work. "No, thank you, Jim. I'm troubled, but I guess I'm well enough. Getting a little rusty in the bones, maybe," she added bitterly. I stood hesitating. "What are you fretting about, grandmother? Has grandfather lost any money?" "No, it ain't the money. I wish it was. But I've heard things. You must 'a' known it would come back to me sometime." She dropped into a chair, and covering her face with her apron, began to cry. "Jim," she said, "I was never one that claimed old folks could bring up their grandchildren, but it came about so; there wasn't any other way for you, it seemed like." I put my arms around her. I couldn't bear to see her cry. "What is it, grandmother? Is it the firemen's dances?" She nodded. "I'm sorry I sneaked off like that. But there's nothing wrong about the dances, and I haven't done anything wrong. I like all those country girls, and I like to dance with them. That's all there is to it." "But it ain't right to deceive us, son, and it brings blame on us. People say you are growing up to be a bad boy, and that ain't just to us." "I don't care what they say about me, but if it hurts you, that settles it. I won't go to the Firemen's Hall again." I kept my promise, of course, but I found the spring months dull enough. I sat at home with the old people in the evenings now, reading Latin that was not in our high school course. I had made up my mind to do a lot of college requirement work in the summer, and to enter the freshman class at the university without conditions in the fall. I wanted to get away as soon as possible. Disapprobation hurt me, I found, even that of people whom I did not admire. As the spring came on, I grew more and more lonely, and fell back on the telegrapher and the cigar maker and his canaries for companionship. I remember I took a melancholy pleasure in hanging a May basket for Nina Harling that spring. I bought the flowers from an old German woman, who always had more window plants than any one else, and spent an afternoon trimming a little work basket. When dusk came on, and the new moon hung in the sky, I went quietly to the Harlings' front door with my offering, rang the bell, and then ran away, as was the custom. Through the willow hedge I could hear Nina's cries of delight, and I felt comforted. On those warm, soft spring evenings I often lingered downtown to walk home with Frances, and talked to her about my plans and about the reading I was doing. One evening she said she thought Mrs. Harling was not seriously offended with me. "Mamma is as broad-minded as mothers ever are, I guess. But you know she was hurt about Ántonia, and she can't understand why you like to be with Tiny and Lena better than with the girls of your own set." "Can you?" I asked bluntly. Frances laughed. "Yes, I think I can. You knew them in the country, and you like to take sides. In some ways you're older than boys of your age. It will be all right with mamma after you pass your college examinations and she sees you're in earnest." "If you were a boy," I persisted, "you wouldn't belong to the Owl Club either. You'd be just like me." She shook her head. "I would and I wouldn't. I expect I know the country girls better than you do. You always put a kind of glamour over them. The trouble with you, Jim, is that you're romantic. Mamma's going to your commencement. She asked me the other day if I knew what your oration is to be about. She wants you to do well." I thought my oration very good. It stated with fervor a great many things I had lately discovered. Mrs. Harling came to the opera house to hear the commencement exercises, and I looked at her most of the time while I made my speech. Her keen, intelligent eyes never left my face. Afterwards she came back to the dressing room where we stood, with our diplomas in our hands, walked up to me, and said heartily, "You surprised me, Jim. I didn't believe you could do as well as that. You didn't get that speech out of books." Among my graduation presents there was a silk umbrella from Mrs. Harling, with my name on the handle. I walked home from the opera house alone. As I passed the Methodist church, I saw 3 white figures ahead of me, pacing up and down under the arching maple trees, where the moonlight filtered through the lush June foliage. They hurried toward me. They were waiting for me, Lena and Tony and Anna Hansen. "Oh, Jim, it was splendid!" Tony was breathing hard, as she always did when her feelings outran her language. "There ain't a lawyer in Black Hawk could make a speech like that. I just stopped your grandpa and said so to him. He won't tell you, but he told us he was awful surprised himself. Didn't he, girls?" Lena sidled up to me and said teasingly, "What made you so solemn? I thought you were scared. I was sure you'd forget." Anna spoke wistfully. "It must make you happy, Jim, to have fine thoughts like that in your mind all the time, and to have words to put them in. I always wanted to go to school, you know." "Oh, I just sat there and wished my papa could hear you. Jim," Ántonia took hold of my coat lapels, "there was something in your speech that made me think so about my papa." "I thought about your papa when I wrote my speech, Tony," I said. "I dedicated it to him." She threw her arms around me, and her dear face was all wet with tears. I stood watching their white dresses glimmer smaller and smaller down the sidewalk as they went away. I have had no other success that pulled at my heartstrings like that one. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nikki Sullivan. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 2, The Hired Girls. Chapter 14. The day after commencement I moved my books and desk upstairs to an empty room where I should be undisturbed, and I fell to studying in earnest. I worked off a year's trigonometry that summer, and began Virgil alone. Morning after morning I used to pace up and down my sunny little room, looking off at the distant river bluffs, and the roll of the blonde pastures between, scanning the Aeneid aloud, and committing long passages to memory. Sometimes in the evening Mrs. Harling came to me as I passed her gate, and asked me to come in and let her play for me. She was lonely for Charlie, she said, and liked to have a boy about. Whenever my grandparents had misgivings, and began to wonder whether I was not too young to go off to college alone, Mrs. Harling took up my cause vigorously. Grandfather had such respect for her judgment that I knew he would not go against her. I had only one holiday that summer. It was in July. I met Ántonia downtown on Saturday afternoon, and learned that she and Tiny and Lena were going to the river next day with Anna Hansen. The elder was all in bloom now, and Anna wanted to make elder-blow wine. Anna's to drive us down in the marshal's delivery wagon, and we'll take a nice lunch and have a picnic. Just us, nobody else. Couldn't you happen along, Jem? It would be like old times. I considered a moment. Maybe I can, if I won't be in the way. On Sunday morning I rose early and got out of Black Hawk while the dew was still heavy on the long meadow grasses. It was the high season for summer flowers. The pink bee brush stood tall along the sandy roadsides, and the cone flowers and rose mallow grew everywhere. Across the wire fence in the long grass I saw a clump of flaming orange-colored milkweed, rare in that part of the state. I left the road and went around through a stretch of pasture that was always cropped short in the summer, where the gaillardia came up year after year and matted over the ground with a deep velvety red that is in Bokhara carpets. The country was empty and solitary except for the larks that Sunday morning, and it seemed to lift itself up to me and come very close. The river was running strong for midsummer. Heavy rains to the west of us had kept it full. I crossed the bridge and went upstream along the wooded shore to a pleasant dressing-room I knew among the dogwood bushes, all overgrown with wild grapevines. I began to undress for a swim. The girls would not be along yet. For the first time it occurred to me that I would be homesick for that river after I left. The sandbars, with their clean white beaches and their little groves of willows and cottonwood seedlings, were the sort of no-man's land, little newly created worlds that belonged to the Black Hawk boys. Charlie Harling and I hunted through these woods, fished from the fallen logs, and until I knew every inch of the river shores and had a friendly feeling for every bar and shallow. After my swim, while I was playing about indolently in the water, I heard the sound of hoofs and wheels on the bridge. I struck downstream and shouted as the open spring wagon came into view on the middle span. They stopped the horse, and the two girls in the bottom of the cart stood up, steadying themselves by the shoulders of the two in front, so that they could see me better. They were charming up there, huddled together in the cart and peering down at me like curious deer when they come out of the thicket to drink. I found Bottom near the bridge and stood up, waving to them. "How pretty you look!" I called. "So do you!" they shouted all together, and broke into peals of laughter. Anna Hansen shook the reins as they drove on, while I zigzagged back to my inlet and clambered up behind the overhanging elm. I dried myself in the sun and dressed slowly, reluctant to leave that green enclosure where the sunlight flickered so bright through the grapevine leaves, and the woodpecker hammered away in the crooked elm that trailed out over the water. As I went along the road back to the bridge, I kept picking off little pieces of scaly chalk from the dried water gullies and breaking them up in my hands. When I came upon the marshal's delivery horse, tied in the shade, the girls had already taken their baskets and gone down the east road, which wound through the sand and scrub. I could hear them calling to each other. The elder bushes did not grow back in the shady ravines between the bluffs, but in the hot, sandy bottoms along the stream, where the roots were always in moisture and their tops in the sun. The blossoms were unusually luxuriant and beautiful that summer. I followed a cattle path through the thick underbrush until I came to a slope that fell away abruptly to the water's edge. A great chunk of the shore had been bitten out by some spring freshet, and the scar was masked by elder bushes growing down to the water in flowery terraces. I did not touch them. I was overcome by content and drowsiness by the warm silence about me. There was no sound but the high, sing-song buzz of wild bees and the sunny gurgle of the water underneath. I peeped over the edge of the bank to see the little stream that made the noise. It flowed along perfectly clear over the sand and gravel, cut off from the muddy main current by a long sandbar. Down there, on the lower shelf of the bank, I saw Antonia, seated alone under the pagoda-like elders. She looked up when she heard me and smiled, but I saw that she had been crying. I slid down into the soft sand beside her and asked what was the matter. "It makes me homesick, Jimmy, this flower, this smell," she said softly. "We have this flower very much at home in the old country. It always grew in our yard, and my papa had a green bench and a table under the bushes. In the summer, when they were in bloom, he used to sit there with his friend that played the trombone. When I was little, I used to go down there to hear them talk. Beautiful talk, like what I never hear in this country." "What did they talk about?" I asked her. She sighed and shook her head. "Oh, I don't know. About music, and the woods, and about God, and when they were young." She turned to me suddenly and looked into my eyes. "You think, Jimmy, that maybe my father's spirit can go back to those old places?" I told her about the feeling of her father's presence I had on the winter day when my grandparents had gone over to see his dead body, and I was left alone in the house. I said I felt sure then that he was on his way back to his own country, and that even now, when I had passed his grave, I always thought of him as being among the woods and fields that were so dear to him. Ántonia had the most trusting, responsive eyes in the world. Love and credulousness seemed to look out from them with open faces. "Why didn't you ever tell me that before? It makes me feel more sure for him." After a while she said, "You know, Jem, my father was different from my mother. He did not have to marry my mother, and all his brothers quarreled with him because he did. I used to hear the old people at my home whisper about it. They said he could have paid my mother money and not married her. But he was older than she was, and he was too kind to treat her like that. He lived in his mother's house, and she was a poor girl come in to do the work. After my father married her, my grandmother never let my mother come into her house again. When I went to my grandmother's funeral, it was the first and only time I was ever in my grandmother's house. Don't that seem strange?" While she talked, I lay back in the hot sand and looked up at the blue sky between the flat bouquets of elder. I could hear the bees humming and singing, but they stayed up in the sun above the flowers and did not come down into the shadow of the leaves. Ántonia seemed to me that day exactly like the little girl who used to come to our house with Mr. Shimerdas. "Some day, Tony, I am going over to your country, and I am going to the little town where you lived. Do you remember all about it?" "Jim," she said earnestly, "if I was ever put down there in the middle of the night, I could find my way all over that little town, and along the river to the next town, where my grandmother lived. My feet remember all the little paths through the woods, and where the big roots stick out to trip you. I ain't never forgot my own country." There was a crackling in the branches above us, and Lena Lingard peered down over the edge of the bank. "You lazy things!" she cried. "All this elder, and you two lying there! Didn't you hear us calling you?" Almost as flushed as she had been in my dream, she leaned over the edge of the bank and began to demolish our flowery pagoda. I had never seen her so energetic. She was panting with zeal, and the perspiration stood in drops on her short, yielding upper lip. I sprang to my feet and ran up the bank. It was noon now, and so hot that the dogwoods and scrub oaks began to turn up the silvery underside of their leaves, and all the foliage looked soft and wilted. I carried the lunch basket to the top of the chalk bluffs, where even on the calmest days there was always a breeze. The flat-topped, twisted little oaks threw light shadows on the grass. Below us we could see the windings of the river and Black Hawk, grouped among its trees, and beyond, the rolling country swelling gently until it met the sky. We could recognize familiar farmhouses and windmills. Each of the girls pointed out to me the direction in which her father's farm lay, and told me how many acres were in wheat that year and how many in corn. "My old folks," said Tiny Solderball, "have put in 20 acres of rye. They get it ground at the mill, and it makes nice bread. It seems like my mother ain't been so homesick ever since my father's raised rye flour for her." "It must have been trial for our mothers," said Lena, "coming out here and having to do everything different. My mother had always lived in town. She says she started behind in farm work and has never caught up." "Yes, a new country's hard on the old ones sometimes," said Anna thoughtfully. "My grandmother's getting feeble now, and her mind wanders. She's forgot about this country, and she thinks she's home in Norway. She keeps asking Mother to take her down to the waterside and the fish market. She craves fish all the time. Whenever I go home, I take her canned salmon and mackerel." "Mercy, it's hot!" Lena yawned. She was supine under a little oak, resting after the fury of her elder hunting, and had taken off her high-heeled slippers she had been silly enough to wear. "Come here, Jim. You never got the sand out of your hair." She began to draw her fingers slowly through my hair. Ántonia pushed her away. "You'll never get it out like that," she said sharply. She gave my head a rough tousling and finished me off with something like a box in the ear. "Lena, you oughtn't try to wear those slippers anymore. They're too small for your feet. You'd better give 'em to me for Yulka." "All right," said Lena good-naturedly, tucking her white stockings under her skirt. "You get all Yulka's things, don't you?" "I wish Father didn't have such bad luck with his farm machinery. Then I could buy more things for my sisters. I'm going to get Mary a new coat for this fall, if the sulky plow's never paid for." Tiny asked why she didn't wait until after Christmas, when coats would be cheaper. "What do you think of poor me?" she added, "with 6 at home younger than I am. And they all think I'm rich, because when I go back to the country I'm dressed so fine." She shrugged her shoulders. "But, you know, my weakness is playthings. I like to buy them playthings better than what they need." "I know how that is," said Anna. "When we first came here, and I was little, we were too poor to buy toys. I never got over the loss of a doll somebody gave me before we left Norway. A boy on the boat broke her, and I still hate him for it." "I guess after you got here you had plenty of live dolls to nurse, like me," Lena remarked cynically. "Yes, the babies came along pretty fast, to be sure, but I never minded. I was fond of them all. The youngest one, that we didn't any of us want, is the one we love best now." Lena sighed. "Oh, the babies come all right. If only they don't come in winter. Ours nearly always did. I don't see how Mother stood it. I'll tell you what, girls," she sat up with sudden energy. "I'm going to get my mother out of that old sod house where she's lived so many years. The men will never do it. Johnny, that's my oldest brother, he's wanting to get married now and build a house for his girl instead of his mother. Mrs. Thomas says she thinks I can move to some other town pretty soon and go into business for myself. If I don't get into business, I'll maybe marry a rich gambler." "That would be a poor way to get on," said Anna sarcastically. "I wish I could teach school, like Selma Crone. Just think! She'll be the first Scandinavian girl to get a position in the high school. We ought to be proud of her." Selma was a studious girl who had not much tolerance for giddy things like Tiny and Lena, but they always spoke of her with admiration. Tiny moved about restlessly, fanning herself with her straw hat. "If I were smart like her, I'd be at my books day and night. But she was born smart, and look at how her father's trained her. He was something high up in the old country." "So was my mother's father," murmured Lena. "But that's all the good it does us. My father's father was smart too, but he was wild. He married a Lapp. I guess that's what's the matter with me. They say my Lapp blood will out." "A real Lapp, Lena?" I exclaimed. "The kind that wear skins?" "I don't know if she wore skins, but she was a Lapp all right, and his folks felt dreadful about it. He was sent up north on some government job he had, and fell in love with her. He would marry her." "But I thought Lapland women were fat and ugly, and had squint eyes like Chinese?" I objected. "I don't know, maybe. There must be something mighty taking about the Lapp girls, though. My mother says the Norwegians up north are always afraid their boys will run after them." In the afternoon, when the heat was less oppressive, we had a lively game of Pussy Wants a Corner on the flat bluff top, with the little trees for bases. Lena was pussy so often that she finally said she wouldn't play any more. We threw ourselves down on the grass, out of breath. "Jim," Ántonia said dreamily, "I want you to tell the girls how the Spanish first came here, like you and Charlie Harling used to talk about." "I've tried to tell them, but I leave out so much." They sat under a little oak, Tony resting against the trunk and the other girls leaning against her and each other, and listened to the little I was able to tell them about Coronado and his search for the 7 golden cities. At school we were taught that he had not got so far north as Nebraska, but had given up his quest and turned back somewhere in Kansas. But Charlie Harling and I had a strong belief that he had been along this very river. A farmer in the country north of ours, when he was breaking soil, had turned up a metal strip of fine workmanship and a sword with a Spanish inscription on the blade. He lent these relics to Mr. Harling, who brought them home with him. Charlie and I scoured them, and they were on exhibition in the Harling office all summer. Father Kelly, the priest, had found the name of the Spanish maker on the sword, and an abbreviation that stood for the city of Cordova. "And that I saw with my own eyes," Ántonia put in triumphantly. "So Jim and Charlie were right, and the teachers were wrong." The girls began to wonder among themselves. Why had the Spaniards come so far? What must this country have been like then? Why had Coronado never gone back to Spain, to his riches and his castles and his king? I couldn't tell them. I only knew that schoolbooks said he died in the wilderness of a broken heart. "More than him has done that," said Ántonia sadly, and the girls murmured assent. We sat looking off across the country, watching the sun go down. The curly grass about us was on fire now. The bark of the oaks turned red as copper. There was a shimmer of gold in the brown river. Out in the stream the sandbars glittered like glass, and the light trembled in the willow thickets, as if little flames were leaping among them. The breeze sank to stillness. In the ravine a ring-dove mourned plaintively, and somewhere off in the bushes an owl hooted. The girls sat listless, leaning against each other. The long fingers of the sun touched their foreheads. Presently we saw a curious thing. There were no clouds, and the sun was going down in a limpid, gold-washed sky. Just as the lower edge of the red disk rested on the high fields against the horizon, a great black figure suddenly appeared on the face of the sun. We sprang to our feet, straining our eyes towards it. In a moment we realized what it was. On some upland farm a plow had been left standing in the field. The sun was sinking just behind it. Magnified across the distance by the horizontal light, it stood out against the sun, was exactly contained within the circle of the disk, the handles, the tongue, the share, black against the molten red. There it was, heroic in size, a picture writing on the sun. Even while we whispered about it, our vision disappeared. The ball dropped and dropped until the red tip went beneath the earth. The fields below us were dark, the sky was growing pale, and that forgotten plow had sunk back into its own littleness somewhere on the prairie. End of chapter 14. Recording by Nikki Sullivan, Chicago. Chapter 15 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nikki Sullivan. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 2, The Hired Girls. Chapter 15. Late in August the Cutters went to Omaha for a few days, leaving Antonia in charge of the house. Since the scandal about the Swedish girl, Wick Cutter could never get his wife to stir out of Black Hawk without him. The day after the Cutters left, Antonia came over to see us. Grandmother noticed that she seemed troubled and distracted. "You've got something on your mind, Antonia," she said anxiously. "Yes, Mrs. Burden. I couldn't sleep much last night." She hesitated, and then told us how strangely Mr. Cutter had behaved before he went away. He put all the silver in a basket and placed it under her bed, and with it a box of papers which he told her was valuable. He made her promise that she would not sleep away from the house, or be out late in the evening while he was gone. He strictly forbade her to ask any of the girls he knew to stay with her at night. She would be perfectly safe, he said, as he had just put a new Yale lock on the front door. Cutter had been so insistent in regard to these details that now she felt uncomfortable about staying there alone. She hadn't liked the way he kept coming into the kitchen to instruct her, or the way he looked at her. "I feel as if he's up to some of his tricks again, and is going to try to scare me, somehow." Grandmother was apprehensive at once. "I don't think it's right for you to stay there, feeling that way. I suppose it wouldn't be right for you to leave the place alone, either, and after giving your word. Maybe Jim would be willing to go over there and sleep, and you could come here nights. I'd feel safer, knowing you were under my own roof. I guess Jim could take care of the silver and old usury notes as well as you could." Antonia turned to me eagerly. "Oh, would you, Jim? I'd make up my bed nice and fresh for you. It's a real cool room, and the bed's right next to the window. I was afraid to leave the window open last night. I liked my own room, and didn't like the Cutters' house under any circumstances. But Tony looked so troubled that I consented to try this arrangement. I found that I slept there as well as anywhere, and when I got home in the morning, Tony had a good breakfast waiting for me. After prayers, she sat down at the table with us, and it was like old times in the country. The third night I spent at the Cutters, I woke suddenly with the impression that I had heard a door open and shut. Everything was still, however, and I must have gone to sleep again immediately. The next thing I knew, I felt someone sit down on the edge of the bed. I was only half awake, but I decided that he might take the Cutters' silver, whoever he was. Perhaps I did not move. Perhaps if I did not move, he would find it and get out of there without troubling me. I held my breath and lay absolutely still. A hand closed softly on my shoulder, and at the same moment I felt something hairy and cologne-scented brushing my face. If the room had suddenly been flooded with electric light, I couldn't have seen more clearly the detestable bearded countenance that I knew was bending over me. I caught a handful of whiskers and pulled, shouting something. The hand that held my shoulder was instantly at my throat. The man became insane. He stood over me, choking me with one fist and beating me in the face with the other, hissing and chuckling and letting out a flood of abuse. So this is what she's up to when I'm away, is it? Where is she, you nasty whelp? Where is she? Under the bed, are you, hussy? I know your tricks. Wait till I get at you. I'll fix this rat you've got in here. He's caught all right." So long as Cutter had me by the throat there was no chance for me at all. I got hold of his thumb and bent it back until he let go with a yell. In a bound I was on my feet, and easily sent him sprawling to the floor, when I made a dive for the open window, struck the wire screen, knocked it out, and tumbled after it into the yard. Suddenly I found myself running across the north end of Black Hawk in my nightshirt, just as someone finds oneself behaving in bad dreams. When I got home I climbed in at the kitchen window. I was covered with blood from my nose and lip, but I was too sick to do anything about it. I found a shawl and an overcoat on the hat rack, lay down on the parlor sofa, and in spite of my hurts, went to sleep. My grandmother found me there in the morning. Her cry of fright awakened me. Truly I was a battered object. As she helped me to my room I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. My lip was cut and stood out like a snout. My nose looked like a big blue plum, and one eye was swollen shut and hideously discolored. Grandmother said we must have a doctor at once, but I implored her, as I had never begged for anything before, not to send for him. I could stand anything, I told her, so long as no one saw me or knew what had happened to me. I entreated her not to let grandfather even come into the room. She seemed to understand, though I was too faint and miserable to go into explanations. When she took off my nightshirt she found some bruises on my chest and shoulders, and she began to cry. She spent the whole morning bathing and poulticing me, and rubbing me with arnica. I heard Ántonia sobbing outside my door, but I asked grandmother to send her away. I felt that I never wanted to see her again. I hated her almost as much as I hated Cutter. She had let me in for all this disgustingness. Grandmother kept saying how thankful we ought to be that I had been there instead of Ántonia. But I lay with my disfigured face to the wall and felt no particular gratitude. My one concern was that my grandmother should keep everyone away from me. If the story once got abroad, I would never hear the last of it. I could well imagine what the old men down at the drugstore would do with such a theme. While grandmother was trying to make me comfortable, grandfather went to the depot and learned that Wick Cutter had come home on the night express from the east, and had left again on the 6 o'clock train for Denver that morning. The agent said his face was striped with court plaster, and he carried his left hand in a sling. He looked so used up that the agent asked him what had happened to him since 10 o'clock the night before, whereat Cutter began to swear at him and said he would have him discharged for incivility. That afternoon, while I was asleep, Ántonia took grandmother with her and went over to the Cutters to pack her trunk. They found the place locked up, and they had to break the window to get into Antonia's bedroom. There everything was in shocking disorder. Her clothes had been taken out of her closet, thrown into the middle of the room, and trampled and torn. My own garments had been treated so badly that I never saw them again. Grandmother burned them in the Cutter's kitchen range. While Ántonia was packing her trunk and putting her room in order to leave it, the front doorbell rang violently. There stood Mrs. Cutter, locked out, for she had no key to the new lock, her head trembling with rage. I advised her to control herself, or she would have a stroke, grandmother said afterwards. Grandmother would not let her see Ántonia at all, but made her sit down in the parlor, where she related to her just what had occurred the night before. Ántonia was frightened, and was going home to stay for a while. She told Mrs. Cutter it would be useless to interrogate the girl, for she knew nothing of what had happened. Then Mrs. Cutter told her story. She and her husband had started home from Omaha together the morning before. They had to stop over several hours at Waymore Junction to catch the Black Hawk train. During that wait, Cutter left her at the depot and went to the Waymore bank to attend to some business. When he returned, he told her that he would have to stay overnight there, but she should go on home. He bought her ticket and put her on the train. She saw him slip a $20 bill into her handbag with her ticket. That bill, she said, should have aroused her suspicions at once, but did not. The trains are never called at little junction towns. Everybody knows when they come in. Mr. Cutter showed his wife's ticket to the conductor and settled her in her seat before the train moved off. It was not until nearly nightfall that she discovered that she was on the express bound for Kansas City, and that her ticket was made out to that point, and that Cutter must have planned it so. The conductor told her the Black Hawk train was due at Waymore 12 minutes after the Kansas City train left. She saw at once that her husband had played this trick in order to get back to Black Hawk without her. She had no choice but to go on to Kansas City and take the first fast train for home. Cutter could have got home a day earlier than his wife by any one of a dozen simpler devices. He could have left her in the Omaha hotel and said he was going to Chicago for a few days, but apparently it was part of his fun to outrage her feelings as much as possible. "Mr. Cutter will pay for this, Mrs. Burden. He will pay," Mrs. Cutter avowed, nodding her horse-like head and rolling her eyes. Grandmother said she hadn't a doubt of it. Certainly Cutter liked to have his wife think him a devil. In some way he depended upon the excitement he could arouse in her hysterical nature. Perhaps he got the feeling of being a rake more from his wife's rage and amazement than from any experiences of his own. His zest and debauchery might wane, but never Mrs. Cutter's belief in it. The reckoning with his wife at the end of an escapade was something he counted on, like the last powerful liquor of a long dinner. The one excitement he really couldn't do without was quarreling with Mrs. Cutter. End of chapter 15, recorded by Nikki Sullivan, Chicago.
Book 3, Lena Lingard, Chapter 1, of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Jeff Cowgill. My Antonia, by Willa Cather. Book 3, Lena Lingard, Chapter 1. At the university I had the good fortune to come immediately under the influence of a brilliant and inspiring young scholar. Gaston Cleric had arrived in Lincoln only a few weeks earlier than I to begin his work as head of the Latin department. He came west at the suggestion of his physicians, his health having been enfeebled by a long illness in Italy. When I took my entrance examinations, he was my examiner, and my course was arranged under his supervision. I did not go home for my first summer vacation, but stayed in Lincoln, working off a year's Greek, which had been my only condition on entering the freshman class. Cleric's doctor advised against his going back to New England, and except for a few weeks in Colorado, he too was in Lincoln all that summer. We played tennis, read, and took long walks together. I shall always look back on that time of mental awakening as one of the happiest in my life. Gaston Cleric introduced me to the world of ideas. When one first enters that world, everything else fades for a time, and all that went before is as if it had not been. Yet I found curious survivals. Some of the figures of my old life seemed to be waiting for me in the new. In those days there were many serious young men among the students who had come up to the university from the farms and the little towns scattered over the thinly settled state. Some of those boys came straight from the cornfields with only a summer's wages in their pockets, hung on through the 4 years, shabby and underfed, and completed the course by really heroic self-sacrifice. Our instructors were oddly assorted: wandering pioneer school teachers, stranded ministers of the gospel, a few enthusiastic young men just out of graduate schools. There was an atmosphere of endeavor, of expectancy and bright hopefulness about the young college that had lifted its head from the prairie only a few years before. Our personal life was as free as that of our instructors. There were no college dormitories. We lived where we could and as we could. I took rooms with an old couple, early settlers in Lincoln, who had married off their children and now lived quietly in their house at the edge of town, near the open country. The house was inconveniently situated for students, and on that account I got 2 rooms for the price of 1. My bedroom, originally a linen closet, was unheated and was barely large enough to contain my cot bed, and it enabled me to call the other room my study. The dresser and the great walnut wardrobe which held all my clothes, even my hats and shoes, I had pushed out of the way, and I considered them non-existent, as children eliminate incongruous objects when they are playing house. I worked at a commodious, green-topped table placed directly in front of the west window, which looked out over the prairie. In the corner at my right were all my books, in shelves I had made and painted myself. On the blank wall at my left, the dark, old-fashioned wallpaper was covered by a large map of ancient Rome, the work of some German scholar. Cleric had ordered it for me when he was sending for books from abroad. Over the bookcase hung a photograph of the tragic theater at Pompeii, which he had given me from his collection. When I sat at work, I half faced a deep, upholstered chair which stood at the end of my table, its high back against the wall. I had bought it with great care. My instructor sometimes looked in upon me when he was out for an evening tramp, and I noticed that he was more likely to linger and become talkative if I had a comfortable chair for him to sit in, and if he found a bottle of Benedictine and plenty of the kind of cigarettes he liked at his elbow. He was, I discovered, parsimonious about small expenditures, a trait absolutely inconsistent with his general character. Sometimes when he came he was silent and moody, and after a few sarcastic remarks he went away again, to tramp the streets of Lincoln, which were almost as quiet and oppressively domestic as those of Black Hawk. Again, he would sit until nearly midnight, talking about Latin and English poetry, or telling me about his long stay in Italy. I can give no idea of the peculiar charm and vividness of his talk. In a crowd he was nearly always silent. Even for his classroom he had no platitudes, no stock of professorial anecdotes. When he was tired, his lectures were clouded, obscure, elliptical. But when he was interested, they were wonderful. I believe that Gaston Cleric narrowly missed being a great poet, and I have sometimes thought that his bursts of imaginative talk were fatal to his poetic gift. He squandered too much in the heat of personal communication. How often I have seen him draw his dark brows together, fix his eyes upon some object on the wall or a figure in the carpet, and then flash into the lamplight the very image that was in his brain. He could bring the drama of antique life before one out of the shadows, white figures against blue backgrounds. I shall never forget his face as it looked one night when he told me about the solitary day he spent among the sea temples that passed him, the soft wind blowing through the roofless columns, the birds flying low over the flowering marsh grasses, the changing lights on the silver cloud-hung mountains. He had willfully stayed the short summer night there, wrapped in his coat and rug, watching the constellations on their path down the sky until the bride of old Tithonus rose out of the sea, and the mountains stood sharp in the dawn. It was there he caught the fever which held him back on the eve of his departure for Greece, and of which he lay ill so long in Naples. He was still indeed doing penance for it. I remember vividly another evening when something led us to talk of Dante's veneration of Virgil. Cleric went through canto after canto of the Commedia, repeating the discourse between Dante and his sweet teacher, while his cigarette burned itself out unheeded between his long fingers. I can hear him now speaking the lines of the poet Statius, who spoke for Dante. I was famous on earth with the name which endures longest and honors most. The seeds of my ardor were the sparks from that divine flame whereby more than 1,000 have kindled. I speak of the Aeneid, mother to me and nurse to me in poetry. Although I admired scholarship so much in Cleric, I was not deceived about myself. I knew that I should never be a scholar. I could never lose myself for long among impersonal things. Mental excitement was apt to send me with a rush back to my own naked land and the figures scattered upon it. While I was in the very act of yearning toward the new forms that Cleric brought up before me, my mind plunged away from me, and I suddenly found myself thinking of the places and people of my own infinitesimal past. They stood out strengthened and simplified now, like the image of the plow against the sun. They were all I had for an answer to the new appeal. I begrudged the room that Jake and Otto and Russian Peter took up in my memory, which I wanted to crowd with other things. But whenever my consciousness was quickened, All those early friends were quickened within it, and in some strange way they accompanied me through all my new experiences. They were so much alive in me that I scarcely stopped to wonder whether they were alive anywhere else, or how. End of chapter 1. Lena Lingard, Chapter 2 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Jeff Cowgill. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 3, Lena Lingard, Chapter 2. One March evening in my sophomore year, I was sitting alone in my room after supper. There had been a warm thaw all day, with mushy yards and little streams of dark water gurgling cheerfully into the streets out of old snowbanks. My window was open, and the earthy wind blowing through made me indolent. On the edge of the prairie, where the sun had gone down, the sky was turquoise blue like a lake, with gold light throbbing in it. Higher up, in the utter clarity of the western slope, the evening star hung like a lamp suspended by silver chains, like the lamp engraved upon the title page of old Latin texts, which is always appearing in new heavens and waking new desires in men. It reminded me, at any rate, to shut my window and light my wick in answer. I did so regretfully, and the dim objects in the room emerged from the shadows and took their place about me with the helpfulness which custom breeds. I propped my book open and stared listlessly at the page of the Georgics, where tomorrow's lesson began. It opened with the melancholy reflection that in the lives of mortals the best days are the first to flee. Optima dies prima fugit. I turned back to the beginning of the third book, which we had read in class that morning. Primus ego in patriam mecum deducam musis. For I shall be the first, if I live, to bring the muse into my country. Cleric had explained to us that patria here meant not a nation or even a province, but the little rural neighborhood on the Mincio where the poet was born. This was not a boast, but a hope, at once bold and devoutly humble, that he might bring the muse, but lately come to Italy from her cloudy Grecian mountains, not to the capital, the Palatia Romana, but to his own little country, to his father's fields, sloping down to the river and to the old beech trees with broken tops. Cleric said he thought Virgil, when he was dying at Brindisi, must have remembered that passage. After he had faced the bitter fact that he was to leave the Aeneid unfinished, and had decreed that the great canvas, crowded with figures of gods and men, should be burned rather than survive him unperfected, then his mind must have gone back to the perfect utterance of the Georgics, where the pen was fitted to the matter as the plough is to the furrow, and he must have said to himself with the thankfulness of a good man, "I was the first to bring the muse into my country." We left the classroom quietly, conscious that we had been brushed by the wing of a great feeling, though perhaps I alone knew Cleric intimately enough to guess what that feeling was. In the evening, as I sat staring at my book, the fervor of his voice stirred through the quantities on the page before me. I was wondering whether that particular rocky strip of New England coast about which he had so often told me was Cleric's patria. Before I had got far with my reading, I was disturbed by a knock. I hurried to the door, and when I opened it, saw a woman standing in the dark hall. "I expect you hardly know me, Jim." The voice seemed familiar, but I did not recognize her until she stepped into the light of the doorway, and I beheld Lena Lingard. She was so quietly conventionalized by city clothes that I might have passed her on the street without seeing her. Her black suit fitted her figure smoothly, and a black lace hat with pale blue forget-me-nots sat demurely on her yellow hair. I led her towards Cleric's chair, the only comfortable one I had, questioning her confusedly. She was not disconcerted by my embarrassment. She looked about her with the naive curiosity I remembered so well. "You're quite comfortable here, aren't you? I live in Lincoln now, too, Jim. I'm in business for myself. I have a dressmaking shop in the Raleigh block out on O Street. I've made a real good start. But, Lena, when did you come? Oh, I've been here all winter. Didn't your grandmother ever write you? I've thought about looking you up lots of times, but we've all heard what a studious young man you've got to be, and I felt bashful. I didn't know whether you'd be glad to see me. She laughed her mellow, easy laugh that was either very artless or very comprehending. One never quite knew which. You seem the same, though. Except you're a young man now, of course. Do you think I've changed? Maybe you're prettier, though you were always pretty enough. Perhaps it's your clothes that make a difference. You like my new suit? I have to dress pretty well in my business. She took off her jacket and sat more at ease in her blouse of some soft, flimsy silk. She was already at home in my place, had slipped quietly into it as she did into everything. She told me her business was going well and she had saved a little money. This summer I'm going to build a house for Mother I've talked about so long. I won't be able to pay up on it at first, but I want her to have it before she's too old to enjoy it. Next summer I'll take her down new furniture and carpet so she'll have something to look forward to all winter. I watched Lena sitting there, so smooth and sunny and well cared for, and thought of how she used to run barefoot over the prairie until after the snow began to fly, and how Crazy Mary chased her round and round the cornfields. It seemed to me wonderful that she should have got on so well in the world. Certainly she had no one but herself to thank for it. Well, you must feel proud of yourself, Lena, I said heartily. Look at me, I've never earned $1, and I don't know that I'll ever be able to. Tony says you're going to be richer than Mr. Harlings some day. She's always bragging about you, you know. Tell me, how is Tony? She's fine. She works for Miss Gardner at the hotel now. She's housekeeper. Mrs. Gardner's health isn't what it was, and she can't see after everything like she used to. She has great confidence in Tony. Tony's made it up with the Harlings, too. Little Nina's so fond of her that Mrs. Harling kind of overlooked things. Is she still going with Larry Donovan? Oh, that's on worse than ever. I guess they're engaged. Tony talks about him like he was president of the railroad. Everybody laughs about it because she was never a girl to be soft. Oh, she won't hear a word against him. She's so sort of innocent. I said I didn't like Larry and never would. Lena's face dimpled. Some of us could tell her things, but it wouldn't do any good. She'd always believe him. That's Antonia's failing, you know. If she once likes people, she won't hear anything against them. I think I'd better go home and look after Antonia, I said. I think you had. Lena looked at me in frank amusement. It's a good thing the Harlings are friendly with her again. Larry's afraid of them. They ship so much grain they have influence with the railroad people. What are you studying? She leaned her elbows on the table and drew my book toward her. I caught a faint odor of violet sachet. So that's Latin, is it? It looks hard. You do go to the theater sometimes, though, for I've seen you there. Don't you just love a good play, Jim? No, I can't stay at home in the evening if there's one in town. I'd be willing to work like a slave, it seems to me, to live in a place where there are theaters. Well, let's go to a show together sometime. You're going to let me come and see you, aren't you? Would you like to? I'd be ever so pleased. I'm never busy after 6 o'clock, and I let my sewing girls go at 5:30. I board to save time, but sometimes I cook a chop for myself, and I'd be glad to cook one for you. Well, she began to put on her white gloves. It's been awful good to see you, Jim. Well, you needn't hurry, need you? You've hardly told me anything yet. We can talk when you come to see me. I expect you don't often have lady visitors. The old woman downstairs didn't want to let me come up very much. I told her I was from your hometown and had promised your grandmother to come and see you. How surprised Mrs. Burden would be. Lena laughed softly as she rose. When I caught up my hat, she shook her head. No, I don't want you to go with me. I'm to meet some Swedes at the drugstore. You wouldn't care for them. I wanted to see your room so I could write Tony all about it, but I must tell her how I left you right here with your books. She's always so afraid someone will run off with you. Lena slipped her silk sleeves into the jacket I held for her, smoothed it over her person, and buttoned it slowly. I walked with her to the door. Come and see me sometimes when you're lonesome. But maybe you have all the friends you want. Have you? She turned her soft cheek to me. "Have you?" she whispered teasingly in my ear. In a moment I watched her fade down the dusky stairway. When I turned back to my room, the place seemed much pleasanter than before. Lena had left something warm and friendly in the lamplight. How I loved to hear her laugh again! It was so soft and unexcited and appreciative, gave a favorable interpretation to everything. When I closed my eyes, I could hear them all laughing, the Danish laundry girls and the 3 Bohemian Marys. Lena had brought them all back to me. It came over me as it had never done before, the relation between girls like those and the poetry of Virgil. If there were no girls like them in the world, there would be no poetry. I understood that clearly for the first time. This revelation seemed to me inestimably precious. I clung to it as if it might suddenly vanish. As I sat down to my book at last, my old dream about Lena coming across the harvest field in her short skirts seemed to me like the memory of an actual experience. It floated before me on the page like a picture, and underneath it stood the mournful line, "Optima dies prima fugit." End of chapter 2.